Welcome everybody. This is Jay Earley, and this is a webinar on the power of internal family systems therapy, primarily known as IFS. And this webinar is intended for therapists, coaches, and other helping professionals. Just a little background on me. I'm a psychologist. I've been practicing psychotherapy for 40 years. And in 2002, I discovered IFS. And I found that it was so powerful, both for my own growth and for my clients, that it became the main modality I use ever since. Of course, what I do is informed by my other 30 some years of, or 20 whatever years of doing therapy. But IFS is so good that everything I do pretty much is using IFS. And in addition to that, I love it so much that I began teaching it and writing about it and so on. So, and just a little bit about, for those of you who don't know IFS, it's a system that works with parts, sometimes called subpersonalities. It's very user-friendly. Most people find it very easy to relate to their parts. It's very powerful and effective, as I mentioned. It does not pathologize clients. It is spiritually oriented. It's very effective with trauma. And it was created by Richard Schwartz, PhD. This is not my creation. It's actually getting to be more and more well-known form of therapy, especially over the last 10 or 15 years. I wrote the book Self-Therapy, which is a manual for doing IFS, which is intended both for therapists and for the general public. And I'm proud to say that there have been 22,000 copies of Self-Therapy sold, even though it's a self-published book, and it's still going strong. My experience with IFS is that I have taught courses for the general public and for therapists on IFS for many years. I've assisted with the professional IFS trainings. I have Bonnie Weiss, who is my wife and work partner, have written books and taught classes on transforming your inner critic using IFS. And I've written many other books and produced many other audio products related to IFS, many of the audio products with Bonnie. I've been leading an IFS consultation training group, or actually a number of groups, for many years. And I've developed an online tool, Self-Therapy Journey, which is based on IFS. So in this webinar, I'm going to start out explaining the IFS understanding of the human psyche. And then we'll talk about the process of doing IFS. And then with that basis, we'll talk about the power of IFS for therapeutic change and for making your life easier as a therapist. And then at the end, we'll talk about opportunities for you to learn about IFS. So IFS works with parts, also called subpersonalities. And you can think of them almost like little people inside you. Each part has its own feelings, its own motivations for what it wants you to do or feel, even its own memories, its own beliefs. So you can really learn a lot about the structures in your psyche by treating them as parts and getting to know them. In IFS, there are two main types of parts. First is protectors. Protectors are basically defenses. There are parts that defend us. They manage our interactions with the external world in order to avoid pain, or at least what they believe is going to lead to pain. And they also defend against allowing us to feel our underlying pain, often from the past. Each protector has a positive intent for you, even though it causes problems, which of course is why you might want to work on it. Nevertheless, it has a positive intent. It is trying to help you or protect you from pain. So just a few examples. People pleaser, inner critic, as you can see, the that little drawing on the right, intellectual parts, procrastinating parts, controlling parts, foggy parts. All of these are examples of protectors, and there are many, many more. Exiles, which are the other main type of part, are wounded inner child parts that carry pain and negative beliefs as a result of painful, harmful childhood situations or childhood relationships. Exiles might be carrying shame or guilt or grief or fear. They might feel worthless or dominated or abused or be afraid of anger. Those are a few examples of exiles. But let's actually look at a specific example. So Sandy decided that she wanted to do a creative video project and put it out in the world. And she decided to start working on it, but she found herself cleaning up first, getting the house straightened, cooking a big meal, going for a walk. And after a while, she realized, I think I'm avoiding this video project. And as she explored inside using IFS, she found the part of her that was avoiding the video project, which she called the busy part, because the way it avoided the video project was by keeping her busy doing other things. That's an example of a protector. It was trying to protect Sandy from the pain or the things that it thought would arise if it allowed her to do the video project. So when she went inside and got to know the busy part, she found that it was afraid that if she did the video project, it would make her visible in the world, and then she would get shamed. And when she explored further, when Sandy explored further, she found that the reason the busy part was afraid of that was because Sandy had another part, an exile, who had been shamed as a child when in a whole series of circumstances in which she had become visible. And so the busy part, the protector, was protecting the exile, which Sandy called the embarrassed child. So those are examples of a protector and an exile. And that's what protectors do. They protect you, they protect us from the pain of exiles, or they try to protect exiles from being hurt by anybody in your life. Now, the other really important concept in IFS is the self. The self is your true self. You might think of it as your spiritual center. It's who you are when you aren't taken over by any of your parts. It's a place of, actually, let me show you. It's a place of compassion, connectedness, both toward other people and towards your own parts. It's a place of curiosity where you're openly curious about your parts, and caring. And you can see all the other C's: courage, creativity, clarity. And another important one is calm, which means that when you're in self, you can work with parts that might be feeling intense feelings, but you will still be calm. So when you're in self, you can work with each of your parts in a healing way, which I'll explain in a minute. And the self is also the leader of your internal system, which means that when you're the ideal leader, anyway, it should be, which means that when you're in self, you make choices and act in the world in a healthy way. Now, one other important concept in IFS is polarization. And this means that two parts are fighting each other to determine your behavior, or sometimes your feelings. So I can illustrate this with the Sandy example. In addition to her busy part and her embarrassed child, Sandy also had a pushy critical part, which tried to get Sandy to do the video project by shaming her. Say, what's the matter with you? You're lazy. Why are you, why don't you get going? And so it was a harsh critical part. And as you can imagine, there's a polarization here between the busy part, which is trying to avoid doing the video project, and the pushy critical part, which is pushing to do the video project. So that's an example of polarization in IFS. Now, the goals for IFS work are to transform each part so that it can be in its natural, healthy role, and to get to the point where each part trusts the self to be the leader of the internal system, and where parts also learn to cooperate with each other. And I'll be explaining in a few minutes how that happens. So let me just say some of the things that make IFS, one of the things that makes IFS powerful is that it's user-friendly. Most clients take naturally to the idea of parts, and it makes it very easy for them to understand and relate to their psychological structures. IFS is also spiritually oriented because the self, and IFS has some really cool techniques for helping clients to access their true self and stay there, at least during sessions and even afterwards. The self is the client's spiritual center. It's equivalent to what is often called the higher self. And for clients who are spiritual, being in self is really a great resource, both for doing IFS sessions, during IFS sessions, and also in their lives. IFS is also not pathologizing. It recognizes that each part has a positive intent for the client, and when you're doing IFS, you welcome each part and respect what it is trying to do, even when the part is being destructive, because you know its heart is in the right place. And the understanding in IFS is that what may look like psychopathology is just parts that are more extreme or more polarized with each other. Okay, let me take a drink of water and we'll go on. So the IFS process, let's start out by talking about working with protectors and how IFS respects protectors. So you choose a part to work with, which is called the target part, which is usually a protector, because in IFS it's usually best to start with a protector, and I'll explain that in a little bit. You can start with exiles, but often it's better to start with a protector. So the first thing you do is to get in self with respect to the target part, which means that it hasn't taken you over. You haven't become the target part. Let's say if you're Sandy's busy part, you're not if you were Sandy and you wanted to work with the busy part at the moment, you wouldn't be being busy and going off and doing other things. You would be, so that means you would be separate from the busy part, but you also want to be openly curious and caring about the busy part. So that's, and there, I won't get into it in this, in this webinar, but IFS has some really interesting ways of helping clients to get into self, and fairly simple ways. From self, you get to know the target part and you discover what it's trying to do for the client, its positive intent. In Sandy's case, it was trying to protect her from feeling shame, at least what it imagined was going to happen if she did the video project. And then you develop the self of the client, develops hopefully a trusting relationship with the part by understanding the part and appreciating it. Okay. Continuing the IFS process, respecting protectors. So the next step, once you've gotten, once a client has gotten to know a protector and developed a trusting relationship with it, is you ask the protector's permission to work with the exile it's protecting. And the reason you do this, there's two reasons why you do this. First of all, it's rarely a good idea to try to work with an exile without first getting permission from any protectors that don't want you to. Because you know what will happen if you do it without doing that is most likely one or more of those protectors will jump in and disrail, sabotage your work with the exile because they're afraid of the exile's pain. They'll take you into your head, they'll get you spaced out, they'll get you angry, they'll get you drinking, distracted, tons of different, numb, all kinds of different things. So you want to always first ask permission from any protectors that might not want you to work with an exile and get their permission first. And there's ways of that IFS has of reassuring protectors and connecting with them so that they will give you permission to work with the exile. The other reason you do this is that IFS understands that even if you've gotten to know a protector and made a connection with it and it trusts you, it's still likely to be hard for that protector to let go of its protective role until the exile it's protecting, exile or exiles that it's protecting are healed. And so in most cases, instead of trying to talk the protector into stopping its protective role, instead you just say, can I have permission to work with this exile that you're protecting? And then you go through the steps to heal the exile, and then you come back to the protector. And then it's pretty likely to let go. So for example, with Sandy, she would get to know the busy part, develop a good connection with it, and then ask its permission to work with the embarrassed exile. And then once the embarrassed exile was healed, Sandy would go back to, of course, Sandy's therapist would direct her through all this. She'd go back to the protector, the busy part, and make sure it now saw that the exile was healed, so it didn't have to create all this busyness distractions anymore. Okay, so the next step, once you've gotten permission to work with an exile, you spend some time getting to know the exile, making sure that the exile feels understood by you. And then you witnessed what happened in childhood to cause the exile to take on its burden or burdens, or you might just say to cause the exile to be in pain. But a burden that's a technical term in IFS, which refers to a painful emotion or a negative belief that an exile takes on as a result of a childhood incident or relationship. Okay, and so you witness what happened in childhood to cause the exile to be carrying the burdens that it's carrying. In this case, Sandy's case, the embarrassed child is feeling shame. That's its burden. And then there's 3 healing steps. Reparenting the exile, where you basically become the good parent for the exile. You give it what it didn't get. You give it a corrective emotional experience. And by the understanding, the neuroscience understanding of memory reconsolidation, you basically, which says that when memories are accessed, each time they get accessed, they get laid down again. So what you're doing here in IFS is you are accessing this painful memory. You are then giving the exile a new, healthy, healing, corrective emotional experience, and then that will get laid down in memory, at least at an emotional level, and partially replace the original memory, which changes the way you feel and the way your psyche is structured in your current life, which of course is what you're aiming for in therapy. So that's reparenting, and then the next step is retrieval, which is based on the fact that the exile is stuck in the past. It's stuck back at age 2 or age 5 or age 10, whenever that harmful or traumatic event or relationship happened. And so one of the options for healing an exile, in addition to reparenting it, is to retrieve it, to take it out of the past, because it's not really in the past anyway. The exile just thinks it is, and bring it into the present, into the client's current life, into the client's heart, or into any other imaginary place where the exile will feel safe and comfortable, and can stay connected to the client. By the way, the reparenting is done, I should have mentioned this, is done by the client's self in most cases, not by the therapist. The therapist is the coach. You coach the client. The client's self is really the healing agent in IFS, the primary healing agent. You as the therapist, you are also a healing agent, but you are a secondary healing, a supportive healing agent. The client's self is the primary agent of healing. Then the third step in the healing process is unburdening the exile, where you actually help the exile to release the painful emotions that it's been carrying and the negative beliefs that's been carrying as a result of that harmful childhood incident or relationship. And then once that's happened, you go back to the protector and ask it, as I mentioned, and say, or make sure it's aware that you've now healed the exile, and check to see if it can now let go of its role now that the exile is safe and happy. And usually they can at that point. Or if they can't, you find out why, and then it tells you what work you need to do next. Okay, so that I've now gone over the IFS understanding of the psyche and the IFS process, and now let me talk a little bit more about some of the things that make IFS so powerful. So one thing is working with trauma. So in IFS, of course, the exiles are the ones that are the parts that carry the trauma. And so if you're doing a session and you are attempting to move toward healing a traumatized exile, there are probably, in the case that it's trauma and not just pain that the exile is carrying, there will often be many protectors that will arise to try to stop you from accessing the exile. And some of them may even be quite intense and quite insistent that they will never let you go near that exile. This is, of course, the way psyche is structured. That's the way defenses operate, especially in the case of trauma. However, in IFS, under your guidance, the client in self gets to know each of these protectors one at a time. The client develops trust with the protectors by getting to know them, respecting their concerns, even if they're not warranted anymore. Although sometimes in the case of trauma, the concerns of the protectors may still be warranted in the present, but nevertheless, under the right circumstances, under the IFS process, it is safe to access the exiles if you do it in the right way. And so you reassure the protector one at a time, that you reassure them about their fears about working with the exile. Usually they're afraid that the client is going to be swamped with trauma, re-traumatized, and of course that could happen. These are not unrealistic fears. But you reassure them that the way you're going to do it using IFS, you as the therapist coach the client to do this because you know what you're doing. You know that the way you're going to work with the with the exile will be done safely. And I'll explain how that happens in a moment. So you help the protectors to recognize that the client being in self and to sense those positive, helpful qualities of the self, connectedness, caring, calmness, groundedness, and so on and so on. And then eventually the protectors will let the client in to work with the exile. Now, how does IFS avoid re-traumatization? How does IFS make it safe for clients to actually work with their traumatized exiles? Here's how it goes. This is a major discovery that Dick Schwartz made. Dick Schwartz, the one who created IFS. First of all, the client gets permission from the protectors to access the traumatized exile. So you're not just diving in. Second of all, the client negotiates, asks the traumatized exile if it would be willing to not flood the client with its pain. And you explain to the exile, or you coach the client to explain to the exile, that if the exile is willing to not overwhelm the client with its pain and trauma, that will allow the client's self to heal the exile and help it to release its trauma and be free of the trauma. And it turns out that exiles do have the power to contain their trauma in this way when they understand that it's in their best interest. And that's why you just, as I said, you just explain to the exile that it is in its best interest to not overwhelm the client with its pain. The exile can have its pain, but it needs to stay separate from the client's self, so the self can be there to heal the exile. That's the way it works to allow the healing, and that's the way it works to avoid re-traumatization, because the client stays in self while they're working with the traumatized exile. They don't just dive in and become flooded with the trauma. Very cool. Okay, so let's talk about a few other things that are interesting about IFS. IFS is a relational therapy, but not in the way that you might think, not in the usual way. The primary relationship in IFS is between the client's self and each part. And that relationship is the vehicle for healing. So the relationship between the client and the therapist is also important because it is a major support for the client's work with their parts. Both you as the therapist are the guide for the client, the coach, you might say, and you coach them in working with their parts. But your relationship with the client is also an underlying support for the client's work with their parts. And of course, sometimes the therapist-client relationship becomes an important part of the work in IFS, not always. And also the relationship between the therapist and some of the client's parts may also be an important part of the therapy. Okay. So you remember I started out saying that IFS was so powerful. Well, let me talk about some of the ways that it's powerful. Some of these may already be obvious to you from what I've said, but I think it's really useful to kind of go through them. For one, let's just talk about accessing the unconscious. Often defenses are in the unconscious, or even if the client is aware of the defense, they may not be aware of the underlying dynamics behind it. So in IFS, you access the protector that is causing the defense, and you ask it about its underlying motivation, and it will tell you. So it's very easy, and this is the way it works in IFS. The way you ask parts, and they tell you. Especially if you're in self, and they can sense that, they will trust you, and they will tell you what you need to know. Another important thing of accessing the unconscious is accessing exiles and getting to them and accessing the childhood memories that are behind the exile's pain, and of course ultimately behind the maladaptive behavior that comes from protectors. So in IFS, once you've accessed an exile, you just ask it to show you the memories. It's very simple. When you actually relating to your psychological, when you're helping your client to relate to their psychological structures as parts, and people, little people that you can talk to, you can ask them and they will tell you. Sometimes they need the parts themselves may need to check inside, do a little introspection to see what you're asking, but they will find and tell you if they trust you. Another thing is that if you have trouble with getting past, one of the things about IFS that it really respects defenses. It doesn't try to barge through defenses. It always asks permission. And in order to get permission, you can reason with a protector, since it's not just a structure, it's a part that you can talk to. You can reason with it, and you can say, if you let me in, I can do this safely, I can heal the part, this is why, and or you as the therapist or coach can coach your client about how to reason with their protectors to let them in. And as I mentioned before, you can negotiate with an exile to not overwhelm the client with its pain or trauma, to make it safe to work with exiles. Again, you can do that because the exile is a little part that you can talk to. And as I mentioned before, there's a healing relationship between the client's self and each part. That, of course, and especially in the reparenting phase. And that, again, you can do that because they're parts. And so you can have an inner relationship between the self and a part. And also because they are parts and not just psychological structures, because they're like little people inside, you can retrieve the parts from the past and bring them into safe places in the present. You can also work with polarized parts. I haven't talked about this, but there's a whole procedure for working with polarized parts where you have them dialogue with each other and learn to cooperate with each other. And of course, the whole IFS process is designed to help parts to trust the self. Again, all of this is possible because you are treating the client's psychological structures as parts that can actually be talked to and gotten to know and connected with. And there's many more things, but this is just a good summary of some of the power you get by working with parts. Let's look at another thing. Some therapies are mainly focused on changing faulty beliefs. Well, IFS does that actually in a very powerful way. Because when usually, well, let's talk about exiles holding, both exiles and protectors can hold faulty beliefs, but let's talk about exiles first. If an exile holds a faulty belief, like Sandy's embarrassed child held the belief that she was bad, that she was, a shameful person. So during the reparenting phase, you can actually reassure an exile that its belief isn't true. And the reason that this is powerful, if you just said to yourself, oh, you didn't do all the prior work and didn't focus on an exile and just said, oh, I'm not really a bad person, how effective would that be? But if you actually go to all the work to access the exile, witness the things that happened to the exile to cause it to feel that it was a bad person, and then from self, you reassure the exile, no, you're not a bad person, you're actually good, and I value you, you're important to me, I think you're really a neat little kid, it goes a long way. And also, once the exile is healed, then usually protectors are also willing to let go of their faulty beliefs. And often then you don't even have to convince them. They're ready to let go. For instance, the busy part had the belief that being visible was dangerous. Well, once the embarrassed child was healed, it was easy for the busy part to let go of that because, the embarrassed child who had gotten ridiculed when she was visible, that had been healed. So there's no reason for the busy part to hold on to that faulty belief anymore. Okay, let's look at another thing, working with the body. IFS can be used very powerfully working through body sensations and body awareness. Some IFS therapists actually combine IFS with actually hands-on types of body therapy, but I'm not going to talk about that. But just as a regular IFS therapist, parts are often experienced through body sensations, both protectors and exiles. Um, so that's an important way of connecting with the part. If you're somatically oriented, that'll be an important part of your IFS work. Or for any client that has a good access to their body sensations, that'll be an important part of their IFS work. Another way that somatic work comes into IFS is that when you want to help a client connect with a part from self, it can be really helpful sometimes to have the client notice how they feel the experience of being in self in their body, which might be like a softening in the heart, or a groundedness in the centeredness in the belly, or groundedness in the legs. And then you can help the client to really connect in a deep way from the self to, let's say, an exile through the body, so that the client can find out, can sense how they experience that exile in the body, like maybe the Sandy's embarrassed child might have been experienced as a sinking in the belly, or as a hot feeling in the shoulders, the shame coming from the shame. And so you could have the client, let's say the client's experiencing self as a soft, loving feeling in the heart. You can have the client radiate that feeling directly from the heart to wherever the exile is experienced in the body. And that's a great way for the self to make a connection with an exile. And then reparenting and unburdening can also happen through body sensations in IFS. I won't get into all the details of that, so I don't make this webinar too long, but if you don't have to do IFS through the body. Some clients are much more visual, and they do a lot of IFS work through seeing images of parts. And most clients actually are able to have conversations with parts where there's an internal dialogue between them in self and the parts. So you don't have to use body sensations as part of IFS, but you can, and it deepens the work for clients who can do that. And so if you're somatically oriented, IFS will be great for you. Now let's talk about emotional release and catharsis. Some forms of therapy are mainly based on the idea of emotional release. In IFS, emotional release is sometimes useful and sometimes not. So there's I think, a very nice discrimination here about when it's important, when it's valuable, why it's valuable, and when it might not be a good idea. So first of all, one of the things we've learned in IFS is that many exiles can be healed without needing any major emotional release. Now, exiles do need to show the self the pain that they experienced in the childhood situation. So they do need to be in touch with that pain, and the self needs to resonate with the exile's pain. So it's not just an intellectual exercise. But that's not the same as a full-blown emotional release of heavy-duty crying or sobbing or raging or whatever it might be. What we found in IFS is that in many cases that emotional release is not necessary for the healing, because we have all these other steps that do the healing. We have the reparenting and the retrieval and the unburdening. However, sometimes emotional release is necessary. And if it is, the exile will know that. The exile will know that it needs to really express its feelings. It's not enough for it just to internally show the feelings to the self. It needs to actually express them. Well, great. If that's true, then you can go ahead and do that. However, you want to make sure that if you're engaging in emotional release, that the client is in self at the same time that the emotional release is happening. So the client is in self and separate from the exile at the same time that the exile is expressing their pain and crying or, getting upset or sobbing or whatever it might, shaking in fear, whatever it might be. The problem with just doing emotional release and other forms of therapy is it's not always done in a way that's safe. It doesn't avoid re-traumatizing the client. This is what will avoid that. So as I said, the self is separate from the exile during emotional release, so it's not overwhelmed and it's not re-traumatized. And the exile knows how much it needs the self to feel its pain. Sometimes the exile needs the self to fully feel its pain. Sometimes it needs to even fully express the pain and have the self witness that. And sometimes it just needs to have the self empathize with some of its pain. The exile will know what it needs, and you can arrange to have it happen exactly as needed. And the important thing here is that on an IFS, emotional release is just one step towards healing. The forms of therapy that think emotional release does the whole healing job. I mean, in some cases it does. In some cases, that's all that's needed. But in many cases, it's not. In many cases, emotional release is not enough in itself. And IFS recognizes that it's just one step toward healing. And there's also reparenting and retrieval and unburdening. Okay. So, as the IFS therapist, what is your job? Well, first of all and foremost, excuse me just a second, I need to blow my nose. First and foremost, your job is to stay in yourself, in your own self. So to be aware during a session if you get taken over by one of your parts, maybe a part that's pushing too hard, or a part that's annoyed at one of your client's parts, or a part that gets triggered because it's similar to one of your client's parts, whatever might happen, it's important. And in IFS training, you get trained to be aware of your parts and notice when they come up in a session, and if they're getting in the way, then how to work with that part to get it to step aside in that session so that you can be in self for the client. And then, of course, you might want to work on it on your own later. But besides that, your main job is to guide the client's IFS process and to coach the client's self. Well, actually, first of all, to help the client get into self, I should have put that in here, and then to coach the client's self in how to work with each of the client's parts one at a time. And then also, big one is to detect when the client isn't in self, because the client may not notice that, and help them to return to self. That's your job. I mean, there's other things, but that's the primary job of the therapist. And as a result, IFS makes your job pretty easy. First of all, because of the fact that you know exactly what to do in terms of the client's inner work to really help change their internal structures and therefore their behavior in the world, it's easier to really focus on the client's inner work and not to get too caught up in worrying about all the external situations that the client may present each week. Of course, you want to be an interested listener and empathic about whatever your client wants to share with you about their life, but generally you don't want to get caught up in trying to help your client fix their external situations, at least before you've done the inner work. And IFS makes it very easy to keep that distinction. At least for me, I find it very easy to say, okay, now we've heard what you had to tell me. Now are you ready to now go inside and start working with a part experientially to help make the changes that you want? Another thing that's really cool about your job as an IFS therapist is you aren't the sole source of healing or even the primary source of healing. The client's self is. Now, of course, there are times when the client really can't access self, when you are, for a while, you provide the self in the room, the self in the system, because the client can't. But your goal is to do that just long enough, and it might take weeks or months, but just long enough until the client is able to access their self and reasonably stay in it during a session, and then the client's self becomes the primary source of healing. Another big thing is that you don't need to know beforehand exactly what the client's underlying dynamics are. I mean, it's nice to, if you can get insight into that. It can help a little bit in terms of how you work with the client, but mostly you don't have to know. You don't have to make interpretations, because the client, because you're working with the IFS process and getting the client to be in touch with each of their parts, and the parts will tell you and tell the client what is going on once you connect with them. So the need to have a detailed, deep understanding of the client's underlying dynamics to figure that out, you don't need to figure it out ahead of time, because it all comes out in the process. And so therefore, you can just relax and trust the IFS process. Now, your job is to guide the client through their process. So your job is more about the client's process, and you and the client will discover their underlying psychodynamics as you go. And the other thing that's really cool that makes it very easy to trust the IFS process is that you always know what to do next. Even if you ask a part to do XYZ and it says no or refuses, or all the different things that can happen to block the client's process at any given moment, given the IFS process as you learn it in the IFS trainings or in my classes, you always know what to do next, no matter what's happening. And mostly because whatever's happening to block the client's process is almost always coming from a protector. It may not be obvious what protector it is, but whenever something is blocked, you just help the client to figure out and access the protector that's blocking their process and begin to work with that protector. So, let me just say, so as a result, as a therapist, it's often, I find it anyway, and Dick Schwartz says the same thing, that he discovered it made his life so much easier as a therapist, that you can just relax, be in self, guide the client's process, and your therapy sessions are interesting, dynamic, and relatively stress-free in most cases. Okay, so now let's move to the last part of the webinar, where I give you some resources for learning more about IFS. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I've written a book called Self-Therapy, which is a manual for IFS, both for therapists and for the general public. It's available in both paperback, ebook, and audiobook form. Get any of those. I've also written a book called Freedom from Your Inner Critic that helps with using IFS to work with inner critic parts. I have a professional series of booklets on IFS. There's 3 of them listed there, you can see. And then also there's a whole series of books written by Dick Schwartz, the creator of IFS. Internal Family Systems Therapy is written for therapists. The Introduction to IFS Therapy, that's for clients. And then he has a new book, You're the One You've Been Waiting For, which is for couples or for people in the couple relationship. Another resource is I teach an IFS basic course, which is intended, well, there's versions of it that are intended for the general public and also versions for therapists and coaches. And even the one that's intended for the general public, which I've taught for many, many years, has been taken by many therapists to help them begin to learn about IFS. And in the basic course, you learn to, participants learn to access self and work with protectors. or for therapists, you learn to help your clients access self and work with their protectors. And there's a 6-week version of these courses by video conference, and there's also a recorded version that you can purchase in our online store. And the basic course is followed by an EXILES course where you learn to work with exiles and how to unburden exiles. And that's also a 6-week course, or there's also a recorded version of that. And since you guys presumably are therapists and coaches, you would be probably most interested in my IFS basic course that's specifically for therapists and coaches, so that you could be able to do that with colleagues. I also offer advanced IFS classes, and these are ongoing classes that meet twice a month. And there are some of these that are just for therapists and coaches, and there are other advanced classes that are mixed therapists, coaches, and more advanced IFS practitioners, more sophisticated people who are using IFS on their own. And in these advanced classes, and by the way, you can take the advanced class once you've taken the basic course. It might even be a good idea to do the EXILES course too but you don't have to. Once you've taken the IFS basic course, then you can enroll for an ongoing advanced course. And here I teach advanced IFS techniques and understandings that go beyond what's in the basic course and the EXILES course, like polarization, like working with inner critic parts, and many other more advanced stuff. It's also an opportunity to work on specific psychological issues as a group. So the group might decide to work on, for a month or a few sessions, to work on procrastination issues or eating issues or whatever you choose. For those of you who are, for you professionals, the advanced IFS classes also contain opportunity for consulting with clients and getting additional training in IFS in a variety of forms. By the way, I should say that both the basic courses and the advanced classes are experiential. They involve me doing demonstration IFS sessions with volunteers from the class, sometimes group experiential exercises or exercises in pairs in the class. And then most importantly, people in the class pair up with each other for homework to practice, do practice IFS sessions with each other. So you can practice working with other people in the class using IFS and also experiencing it as a client from somebody else in the class. These classes are done by video conference. All the classes, both the basic classes and the advanced classes, are now done by video conference. This is a fairly new thing, so that we all get to actually see each other. So it's almost like being in person. I actually have there's actually 4 different times, 4 different options for the advanced IFS classes. So you have a number of choices. And as I mentioned, the basic class is a prerequisite. I also have an IFS consultation training group for therapists and coaches who are using IFS with their clients. It meets once a month. It involves both consultations and questions about using IFS with clients, and also demo sessions with volunteers from the group. Other IFS resources. We have an online store that includes recordings of IFS demo sessions, a whole bunch of them, a whole bunch of different IFS guided meditations, recorded versions of not only of a number of different IFS courses, recorded versions of many webinars that I've done, and my the IFS books. I also have created an online tool, an application, a program that you access online that's based on IFS, where you or clients can go on and choose an issue to work on and be guided through working on that issue based on IFS. And it actually goes beyond IFS. It helps clients set up, or helps you set up, homework practices for changing behavior and so on. And there's the website, selftherapyjourney.com. There's also the Center for Self-Leadership, which is the organization created by Dick Schwartz. That's the official IFS website. That includes a listing of IFS therapists by location. So it's it also includes information about professional IFS trainings. You know, the basic IFS course for therapists that I was talking about, even though it's a professional course, it's not a full IFS training. It's just an introduction to IFS. If you get serious about IFS, you will probably want to take you should really take the professional IFS training offered through the Center for Self-Leadership under the supervision of Dick Schwartz. And their website, as you can see at the bottom, is selfleadership.org. Includes many writings by Dick Schwartz and a lot of other interesting stuff about IFS. So make sure to check that out. If you're interested in getting IFS sessions or going into IFS therapy, there's various options. You can do them, of course, in person or by telephone or by Skype. And you can do them with me, with Bonnie Weiss, my wife, and a very experienced, very excellent IFS therapist. We can also refer you to people that we know who are good IFS therapists, or, as I mentioned, you can go on the Center for Self-Leadership site and access their list of IFS therapists. They have them a list not only by location, but also by those therapists who are willing to do IFS sessions over the phone, which I'm sure also includes Skype. And we're getting to the end. Here's a few links. My IFS website, as you can see here, is personalgrowthprograms.com with hyphens between the words. There's my email address, earley.j@gmail.com, and then our online store is the personalgrowthprograms.com/products. And those of you who are actually taking this as a webinar will get a follow-up email with links to all the different resources that I discussed here. If you're just watching this as a video on YouTube, of course, you won't get that. So I wanted to give you these links here. But of course, you can easily find me just searching J. Earley IFS on the web, and it'll all come up too. So thank you very much. And this is the end of the webinar.